The dedication to Eastern spiritualism that had sustained George Harrison in life, and which had been the subject of his biggest solo hit, also sustained him as he faced the prospect of his own death. Harrison was a follower of the Hare Krishna religion and believed in its promise of an afterlife, a faith he'd held since the Beatles' encounter with the Maharishi on the group's famous spiritual voyage through India. Yet at this hospital in Staten Island, Harrison had made a last-ditch effort to stay in this life, undergoing high-dosage radiation therapy for the lung cancer he had developed. This had followed earlier treatment at a clinic in Switzerland for a brain tumor. Harrison had suffered from throat cancer as well. Through the years of his physical decline, Harrison had made only rare public appearances, here at a court hearing during a copyright case in London.
Here are the Beatles!
And in dramatic contrast to the hysterical publicity of his life as a Beatle, George Harrison had been the youngest and the quietest of the Fab Four. The mania never sat very well with him.
In the Beatles, we didn't really know anything. We just followed our gut feeling, or, you know, we just made it up as we went along.
Harrison was the most enigmatic of the Beatles and seemed to prefer it that way. But as time has gone by, he's been given more and more credit for the group's unprecedented success. George Harrison wasn't the cute one, or the brash one, or the funny one, but he may have been the backbone of the group's musical strength. Harrison was just 27 when the band broke up. He had had his financial ups and downs since then, mostly ups. He'd backed the Monty Python group in the controversial and ultimately successful Life of Brian, and joined Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, and Tom Petty in perhaps the most successful studio group ever, the Traveling Wilburys. But he lived a reclusive life in Hawaii and on this English estate, where in 1999 he narrowly escaped death at the hands of a knife-wielding attacker. And not so long ago he mused on how quickly it had all gone.
It doesn't take long to be from 17 to being 57. 40 years just goes like that.
George Harrison leaves his own musical legacy, a legacy with an uncanny relevance to the lives of millions and to his own.
It's not always gonna be this way. All things must pass. All things must pass away.
For The Early Show, I'm Mark Phillips in London.
Brian. All right, Jane, in Los Angeles is Billy Preston. He's known George Harrison since 1962 and for many years was often called the fifth Beatle. Mr. Preston, good morning.
Good morning.
When did you last see George or speak with him?
It's been about 10 years now.
What kind of friendship did the two of you have?
We had a real close friendship. It was a spiritual one, and we'd always say whenever we weren't together, we were always together spiritually.
You were already touring with Little Richard when you first met George. What drew you to him and the Beatles?
Well, they were opening act for Little Richard, and while they were playing, they would ask me, George asked me to come out and play with him. And I didn't, because Little Richard would have gotten mad and I was playing for Little Richard. But George was always the one to invite me to come. Years later, when I was with Ray Charles, he came to the concert and invited me to come and see the boys, and I went, and that's when I started working with them on Let It Be.
You became one of the first artists to sign with the Beatles, Apple Records, and I believe George co-produced an album with you. What kind of a producer was he?
Oh, he was great. He was very inspirational to me. He encouraged me to, that was the first time I had sang any of my songs that I had written on an album, and he was a big influence on me.
You remain the only man ever to be credited on a Beatles album, as an album with the Beatles. How did that collaborative effort work?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was just great to be with them. I was in awe with just being in the room with them. There was a glow when they were all in a room together. And when the record came out with my name on it, I didn't know it until John handed me the record and I saw my name on it. It was a wonderful surprise.
Billy, he knew the kind of fame that the vast majority of people never will. How did it change him?
Well, I don't think it really did. I mean, George was a spiritual person, and he was well grounded in his beliefs, and he never let it affect him.
All right. Billy Preston, thanks very much. Appreciate you getting up with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
DeCurtis writes for Rolling Stone magazine, and he interviewed George Harrison several times and can shed some light on the Fab Four's guitarist. Anthony, thanks for coming in.
A pleasure.
I'm going to talk about George Harrison from several standpoints here, but as a musician, what do you think his legacy is going to be?
Well, probably his major legacy is going to be introducing Eastern music to Western popular music. You know, now we take for granted pop artists exploring music in other cultures and introducing it into their own sound. But before George Harrison introduced Indian music into the Beatles sound, that really was never done before.
Ravi Shankar and the sitar.
Absolutely.
As a man, how do you think George Harrison is going to be remembered?
I think the main thing, certainly that he would want remembered, and I think that registers in his music and what he liked to talk about, was his spirituality. You know, he was somebody, you know, all of the 60s kind of trappings of the East and mysticism and that sort of thing was not at all a fad for him. That was something that formed the bedrock of his belief, and I'm sure sustained him through the last weeks of his life.
As we've pointed out several times this morning, he was known as the Quiet Beatle. Do you think he would be surprised at the outpouring of emotion following his death?
Well, it's funny. He had a very wry view of what the Beatles were. You know, he would always refer to them rather almost dismissively as the Fabs and that sort of thing. And at the same time, as he was well aware of the kind of impact that they made, and it was fine for him to dismiss them. If you did, it was a problem, you know. So I think he would appreciate people's affections and concerns, and I think he would hope that people would, you know, maybe think about some of the things he wrote about.
A lot of people forget he was only 27. These guys were very young.
Extremely. And he was the youngest one, you know.
27 years old. I mean, how did his life change after that, musically?
Well, he went through a kind of real period of forced growth with the Beatles. You know, he was the youngest guy, and, you know, he was in a band with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, you know, one of the greatest songwriting teams of the 20th century. But by the mid-60s, he had developed his own voice as a songwriter, and so by the time the Beatles ended, he was very eager to come forward, because at a point where John Lennon and Paul McCartney could agree on almost nothing else, they agreed that their song should take precedence over George Harrison's, and that became really an untenable situation for him by the end of the band.
Very quickly, of course, as we said, you interviewed him twice. If you had to give one sentence summing up who he was, what would that sentence be?
A very kind of centered, spiritual person. You know, I was struck by how deeply he believed that stuff and, you know, lived it.
Anthony DeCurtis, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.